too late. They can't start without me.
I didn't know.
Well.
Not sure. As a matter of fact,
I saw panic responses.
have you, Gary? Is PS is PS supposed to be here?
But
Pao Shin?
if he doesn't show up,
Then you don't have to talk. Yeah. Yep. 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 Okay. Yeah. Well.
Is everybody here who's coming?
Well, here's one. Yeah, here's one we need.
I promise two things. That he would have the last word, and that this would not be a roast. Well, at least not a full-blown roast. So we will see where it goes from there. The last slide will be a red one.
Right.
The first one's a green.
Wayne, before you get rolling on that, because I don't want to break you in the middle. 30 seconds.
The floor, the chair yields to the real chair.
Every once in a great while, people really just
We'll
have no idea that they've been here for so bloody long. And once again, it's time to give one of those marvelous wooden pens to one of our faculty members who's been here longer than God knows. Pao Shin, congratulations on 30 years. Thank you, Wayne.
You're welcome. We have one next week? Another one? Okay. For those who follow on, or who have to do lights in the future, it looks like you want number 3, your cheat sheet before we get into it. Okay. Today's talk is sort of a negotiation between Tom and me, and we ended up with how we got here, perspectives from an old-timer given by Professor Emeritus Thomas Schroeder. And he's been here, the record shows, for 42 straight years. And many of the rest of us last 42 years, I might be a little surprised. And so, since he's actually been in retirement since, I believe it's December of 2011, is that correct, Tom?
Great.
Okay. Tom, in 1974, arrives here in Honolulu from the Midwest. Then he probably had an Indiana accent with a little bit of Michigan in there. Now he probably talks pidgin pretty well. Very young assistant professor, and under the fairly strong influence of the professor and long-term chair, Colin Ramage. Meteorology at that time, or shortly before that, is not a department. Tom can tell us when the transition actually occurred. He probably did tell us about 10 years ago when we were talked to history. But at that point in time, meteorology was not a department. It was part of the Hawaii Institute of Geophysics, and Colin Ramage was the associate director of HIG way back in prehistory. Meteorology faculty at that time were Ramage and Sadler. Jim Sadler was with the Air Force and for a long time, came here. Professor Murakami came here from Japan. I believe Professor Daniels came just a year before, 1973.
No, 1970.
7. Years before. Professor Takahashi ran the cloud physics lab over in Hilo, and there are others that I don't recall exact names at that point in time, but it doesn't matter for this introduction. Professor Ramage retired around 1987, and Tom took the god-awful position of assuming the chair during a fairly tumultuous time around this place, 1987-89. About half of the Met faculty retired in those 3 short years. When I came on board in 89, I think we were down to about 5. Several new Met faculty were recruited, and I think Hao Shin and Dave Chen and Ben Wang are still with us, right, during those times. At that time, the 4 academic departments proposed to leave the College of Natural Sciences, joined with several research units, and formed SOAS with Barry Raleigh as who was hired as the permanent founding dean. Another point I note is that in the past 18 years, Tom has served as department chair for about 9 of those 18 years. So just a little perspective from people who've been here, well, for 25 years. Some professional interests at the University of Hawaii. I'll mention for Tom, the local weather and climate of a remote archipelago in the Pacific. I'll note that's a little bit different from what he saw in Indiana, I expect. And some of the things he's looked at is rain climatology, diurnal cycle, the HARP experiment in 1990. He's very interested in, and has been, in hurricanes in the region. And in fact, as we've observed this week, the hurricanes apparently plan to keep on threatening us, even if Tom moves to eastward after more than 40 years. And I just picked up, this is about as active as I've seen. 3 hurricanes in a row. This is from the Honolulu Star Bulletin on Monday, I believe it was. And so we aren't done yet. And this is the picture of, given on August 30th, of the conditions that could spell, they claim, somebody has claimed a record season for storms. Okay? Looks like the 9th named storm. So, Tom's also done a lot of the organizing of the undergraduate and graduate curriculum for a long, long time. If you have any issues about that, we'll be sure to get Tom's email so you can chase him down. And even after his retirement, December 11, Tom has been very active on a tough issue. If you read the newspaper over the past year, involving the Cancer Center, and was, I believe, the co-chair of the committee that really got things moving on that.
Worse than that, I was the only chair.
Oh, Lucas wouldn't hang around with that?
Now he was the co-chair.
Okay, the original committee, you 2 were co-chairs. At least I saw some doc, not of the Cancer Center, but the vice president's advisory. Evolving interests: golf for a long time, distance running, non-distance walking, and probably some non-distance, non-running, you might call it. And he's going to head, he prefers not to ride heavy rail, he's going to ride light rail in the rain. And today, he has the final word on how we got here, his perspective from someone who's seen it all for 40+ years.
I'm not sure about having seen it all, but seen too much probably. Some of my colleagues would agree with that, right? Yeah, this evolved. This is for those who are Tolkien fans, this is from a chance encounter in Middle-earth. Namely, Dwayne and I ran into each other on Friday, and I was getting ready to ship my tusk off to the elephant's graveyard, and I mentioned that I was leaving town, and he said, he called me over the weekend about having the last chat, especially for the new students and like that, and the young faculty, about the history of the place a little bit. So from my perspective on I called it How We Got Here, an old-timer talks about what he's seen, I guess. And I have a few observations about universities and the university. And the politics, which is always in the background. I go over with Mike back. Mike Model, a good long-time department chair. We know we've dealt with this a while, right? So let's see what we have here. I'm just kind of going to go through a little timeline from when the Earth cooled, about the origins of this department. And it's kind of ironic because, okay, I've got some students from the PRC, for example, in the audience. What's happening today in Beijing? You know, in honor of what? 70th anniversary of the Missouri sitting in Tokyo Bay, where they signed the surrender documents. So end of World War II. And that's an interesting link, because as I started talking about how we got into this, of course, some of us old-timers know that meteorology kind of blossomed during World War II, because we suddenly were doing things like fly bombers over other places and like that. And weather became a big issue. Ask the German army at Stalingrad, right, or something like that. So the origin I'm going to start our story with, but right post-World War II and what was happening in Hawaii, what was meteorology in Hawaii? And the answer was, there were a couple things going on. If you do the late 40s and early 50s, you'd find out that the U.S. Air Force had an operation at Wheeler Field, headed by a guy from UCLA named Clarence Palmer, who was a New Zealand expatriate. For those who are real old-timers and have ever seen something called the Compendium of Meteorology, which is a real ancient document published in 1950 by the AMS, you'd find that Palmer wrote the chapter on the tropics. And they were basically, what were they supporting? Well, the story comes, well, what was going on in the 50s in the Pacific that the Air Force cared about, where weather would have been an issue? The Marshall Islands bomb test. The nuclear programs. Okay, one of the people who worked with Palmer's group off and on was a young guy named Jim Sadler. There was a major program in weather modification. Okay, historically, Schaefer and Vonnegut were doing their experiments in the 40s as something called Project Cirrus, which was part of the war effort again, is dealing with cloud formation and such. And they had some success in seeding cold clouds. Vonnegut and Schaefer they did experiments in upstate New York, 1945 or so. This was actually not at the university. It was General Electric Schenectady Labs. The program was headed by Irving Langmuir, the Nobel laureate in chemistry. But the people out here in the Cattlemen's Association, the Pineapple Research Institute, and the Cattlemen's Council said this is the solution to our problems of water for agriculture. So they threw a lot of money into a program in local weather and weather modification. It operated not as part of the university. Matter of fact, their headquarters, the HSPA headquarters, where this work was done, is now called the McKeekee Library. The Pineapple Research Institute location where this was done is called Krause Hall. You'll still see on the wrought iron gate, you'll see PRI on the gate on the back side of the building. That's Pineapple Research Institute. So that was happening, and the National Weather Service was active. We had a guy named Bob Simpson here. Simpson was here from the about 47, say 48 to the early 50s. And he was the only, if you look for published literature on Hawaiian weather at that time, you'll find it's all Bob Simpson. He named the first hurricane Hiki. There'd never been the term used before until 1950. He wrote the first paper on volcanic haze, the great Mauna Loa haze of 1950, Pacific-wide haze from a volcanic eruption. He also wrote the first paper on Kona lows. And, oh, by the way, he founded an observatory on the summit of Mauna Loa called the original Mauna Loa Summit Observatory. So he was the university wasn't doing anything. So time passes, and by 1956, Simpson was gone, back to the mainland, National Hurricane Research Project. The U.S. Air Force was shutting down the Wheeler operation. Project Shower, there was a project called Project Shower, which was kind of the capstone of the cloud seeding experiments. Of course, what was the problem? The clouds here weren't the kind of clouds that Schaefer and Vonnegut were looking at. Those were cold clouds. Hawaii clouds were warm clouds. Guess what? We've wasted 10 years of money to find out we had the wrong idea. History cloud seeding is full of, weather mod is full of stories like that, right? So suddenly, they dissolved the whole program, fired everybody. There's some interesting characters involved too, like Luna Leopold, who was famous later as a geologist. He was a weatherman then. We had David Johnson, who became the first head of NEST, when the satellite service. So we had a number of interesting characters. Wendell Morty, who went off to Minnesota and disappeared. So about the same time, the Air Force said, though, well, but the university ought to start a program at the university and we'll fund it. So the original money came from the U.S. Air Force to create a program at the university. Palmer recommended Colin Ramage, Colin was then the director at, the deputy director of what was then called the Royal Observatory in Hong Kong, which now, since the political changes, is now just called the Observatory in Hong Kong, but that was when Britain still had Hong Kong as a colony. And he was a New Zealander, and this is going to get into the World War II connection a little more too. Colin's quote, though, when he told me when he arrived, every meteorologist in Hawaii was unemployed. That was his comment. He was the only employed meteorologist, basically. There were some weather service people, but everybody else was out of work. I wanted to comment a little bit about that generation, though, because of the connections here. There were one other name that, of the list of who was here before Dwayne, was a guy named Carl Adams, who was a Navy, he was a Navy officer, a submariner, an academy grad, and he in 1941, December 7, 1941, was on a ship sitting off anchor at Lahaina Roadstead when Pearl Harbor was bombed. So he goes back that far. He came into the department in the 60s as a retiree, and he actually primarily just a pure teacher. He was a great teacher. He was very methodical, a wonderful teacher, and offered in about 1960 or 61, he offered a course in oceanography out of the meteorology program. As far as we know, the first one offered here was actually out of meteorology. There was no such thing as a Department of Oceanography back then. Ramage was in the New Zealand, Her Majesty's New Zealand Navy in the war. Murakami actually flew planes for Japan. So we had little pieces all around the area there. And then I wanted to comment about Jim Sadler a little bit, because a lot of connections here. 56, okay, we're talking about, right? Sadler kind of was moving around the Air Force, doing a number of different things. He was the first mayor of Sunspot, Colorado, or New Mexico, where the Sac Peak Observatory was. He was there when they built the Sac Peak Observatory. So he moved around doing a lot of things with the Air Weather Service. But I was quizzing a few of the young faculty. Mike recalls this quiz the other day. On August 6th, I was asking a few people, and I said, 70 years ago today, across the date line, on the island of Tinian, a young weather officer was watching a solitary B-29 take off. He had no idea what was on the plane. But the little quiz was, tell me what was the name of the plane? Enola Gay, and the weather guy was Sadler. Turned out he was a lot of people got into meteorology in World War II because Jim had a degree in engineering from Tennessee Tech. And as soon as he graduated, what happened? He got drafted. Oh, you know math, you know physics. Guess where you're going? MIT for weather training. And that's how a lot of people got into the field at the time. You'd be amazed at some of the ironies and connections, but the Dean of Natural Science back in the 70s, 80s, Bob Texock, was flying as a weather officer on PBYs in front of Halsey's fleet. And like that, a lot of people went back to chemistry, but if you had a science background, you're going into weather. That was the way it was. And the tale is kind of interesting because Sadler followed the B-29s everywhere, and in 56, as the program starting here, he had a lot of affiliations here. It's not widely remembered, but the British had their own bomb program. And they were doing the testing where? In the Line Islands, south of here. And Sadler had given them the as the ally, right? He's giving them the outlook of what it's going to be like on Christmas Island while they're there. Christmas Island's a desert island on the equator, so it's going to be what? You're going to need a lot of suntan lotion and such, right? Well, it turned out, what was 1957? The IGY El Nino. And so it turned out all the British scientists were hiding in their tents the whole time because it was raining so damn much. So it was a complete busted forecast, but it had good impacts on Sadler's memory, because okay, that became the first real El Nino that happened to be when there was a science project on the IGY, International Geophysical Year for the youngsters. I read about it when I was in junior high. That was in our weekly reader, was the IGY. Tell you how far back I go, right? Okay, so that had a big impact on Sadler. The other thing was because of the role of, why was the Air Force so interested in the tropics, and why were they following around with the B-29s? Well, of course, nobody knew a damn thing about what the upper structure of the atmosphere in the tropics was. And one of the famous stories that you hear about occasionally, only from real old grizzled salts, would be the story of Sadler's Trough. Okay? And it goes back to the fact that they had some little accidents during the Marshall Islands bomb tests. They had this little problem once in a while. They would forecast which way the fallout's going, and every once in a while it turned out they were only off by 180 degrees. And history is full. Some of you know the history, right? You know, what is it? Which island out there was it that had to be evacuated? You know, basically the wind went the wrong way, the fallout saturated the island. I'm thinking, was it Eniwetok, or was it, what's the other island? I'm slipping me right now. Bikini, where the natives had to actually be evacuated. And it's still hot, right? So Sadler deduced the existence of a trough overhead, which nobody had believed. It was called Sadler's Trough. Now it's routinely analyzed every day as the Tut. So that was Sadler's Trough. So the whole color, so we got this whole coloration of things going around the 50s, the bomb test, and that kind of stuff. All right. So that's 56. The department starts up. In 59, something happened called statehood, and we had two of it. There was the founding of, in Hawaii, there was the creation of the HIG, the Hawaii Institute of Geophysics, which had a sister, there was a sister institute created the same year in Alaska called the Geophysical Institute at Fairbanks. So here comes HIG. Didn't have a building yet. We had a few geologists. Ralph Moberly arrived in 59. Okay. And right away, the University of Hawaii uniqueness kicks in for those that are going to, who follow, especially for the young faculty. The old faculty were probably sick of this, but first thing you find out is the structure here is quite interesting at Hawaii, because we have something called organized research units. And we have actually tenured positions in research. Tom Apple had a real problem with that, right? But that was a creation, actually partly as an inducement to get people out here. Why pack up and come to Hawaii in the 50s, right? Or the early 60s. So we have this issue of research positions, instructional positions, split positions. Chip is a specialist on these things now too, right? As an associate dean for. So these are some of the structures and oddities that we have out here. Okay. And the other thing I will say is, having been I came out of a geoscience program at Purdue, and even in one department, if you have, in this case we had soft rock and hard rock geologists, and we had atmospheric scientists, and guess how, were there any rivalries or competitions? Bet your bippy. So it's the nature of the beast wherever you go, pretty much, whether it's in SOAST or anywhere. You live with it. Okay. The department was in a very good position for a lot of reasons at that time in the late 50s and 60s. So for example, in 1963, we could arguably say the first big ocean atmosphere experiment actually took place. It was called the International Indian Ocean Expedition. And it was a 2-year study of the monsoon oceans of Australasia, we'll say. The Australasian monsoon, the oceans, the whole 9 yards. The meteorological part was led by a guy named Colin Ramage. The oceanographic part was led by a guy named Klaus Wirtke. Okay, this is when I arrived, they still had book compilations of the books of the outcomes of the Indian Ocean, IIOE. In 65, NSF funded a observatory on the Hilo campus called the Cloud Physics Observatory, specifically to go back and study the rain that they didn't get right in the 50s, warm rain. And it started with a project called Project Warm Rain. It was a part of the department, remotely placed. 3 faculty down there, 7 at Manoa, with plans of interchange. One of the reasons I was hired was because I was young, unmarried, and I could bounce back and forth. Well, the operation never really worked out well. Why? Because, well, the other people that would be bouncing back and forth were married and they didn't want to move. So this whole concept, it was a great concept that never worked out. But it was a part of our department, and we used it for many years. It was still a focal point around the Hawaiian Rain Band project in 1990. It survived as an entity till the late 80s, but it became hard to maintain. And plus, people were kind of losing interest in weather modification at the time also. Okay. All right. 1967. Okay, and geostationary satellites. The first geostationary satellite was ATS-1, it was called, Applications Technology Satellite 1, which was launched in the Pacific. A lot of us, like by the time Pao Shin and Dave were in school, we were seeing things about ATS-3, which was the one in the Atlantic, right? But ATS-1 was launched out here, and they had a special program called the Line Islands Experiment, which brought, in those days, NCAR even, a young NCAR came out here. And there was an experiment, we got this new experimental satellite. Well, what's really down there? So we had a major project, again, because we're in Hawaii and we were in the right place. So this kind of goes on and on. Another thing that comes out, which is kind of interesting as we're going through reminiscences, and this is just before I arrived, there was this dirty little war in Southeast Asia. And Steve and I had lunch, 2 weeks ago? 3 weeks with Ken Kupchak, an attorney in town who was an Air Force weather officer in Vietnam. He actually was a Tanzanite for the Tet Offensive. And you had fundamental problems in Vietnam. Was, of course, you'd load B-52s in Guam, fly them to Hanoi, and Kupchak said, by the way, we were really predictable. We bombed at 8 and 4, so they knew when we were coming. He said it, didn't he, Steve? He said he was kind of candid about this World War II generals trying to fight a 1960s war. But if you get there and it's cloudy, what do you do? What do you do? You have the loads of bombs. So what do you do with the bomb? You don't want to just knock out civilians. You just turn around and dump them in the ocean. You're not going to land with them, right? So getting the forecast right for Vietnam was a big deal, and it turned out there was a major program funded here. It was kind of interesting at the height of the Vietnam War. You can imagine how popular it would be to see officers in uniform walking in and out of the HIG building. But Jim told me, the Sadler told me the story that, well, the Kaleo came to talk to him one time, why are you doing this? And he said, well, you know, if we get the forecast right, less people die on both sides. And Kaleo reporter said, well, that sounds pretty good. Went away, never had a problem. They burned the ROTC building, but they never bothered with the program at HIG. So here's the story. Okay. Now, as Dwayne alluded here, around 1970, we'll say use a cliche language, the centrifugal effects within HIG led to some contretemps that led to a move. Originally, I've been told this story different ways. I don't know who else has heard it. Maybe Mike's heard it from somebody, but the original story was that the geology and geophysics department were really mad and wanted to leave the institute. Well, it turned out, as the arguments developed, Ramage got madder, and so at the end of the meeting, the group that left the institute was meteorology. Now, that was 1970, but to point out how well the university does this, right? 1970, I arrived when? What did it say somewhere? 74. Well, I met Doc Woolard, who was still the director of HIG at the time, on one of the Friday events. And he said, oh yeah, I'm still signing your employment forms, which means, of course, they never transferred the positions yet. So I was still even though I'm a full-time meteorology department member, I'm still having my timesheet, my paperwork vetted through the HIG director. That's only 4 years, but what's a few years, right? The irony was, it took them about another 4 years to catch up. But when they caught up, suddenly we have this fundamental issue, because if you took the assignments that people were doing back at that time, between Hilo and Manoa. We had an FTE count, I was going to say about 8 1/4. Sadler was only 25% the whole time he was here. He funded himself fully the rest of the way. For, what was it, 22 years or something like that. He totally funded, 3/4 of his salary he raised himself. And supported the staff, right, Arnold? And so of the 8 1/4 or so, I'd say the instructional count would have been 3. But through the magic of the pen, when we left HIG and left the split position, we suddenly showed up as 8.25I. And on all Al Simone's statistics, we went to the top as the most faculty for fewest students. And that made us a target in perpetuity almost, but definitely back then. That's one of the things one of the things I walked into in the 80s. This was going on. Okay. So we had that issue for a long time of just, we actually were doing the same functions we did before we left, but well, now the world doesn't count them that way. So, and you can actually find a reference if you wanted to. If you were clever, you could read some David Yount's book on who runs the university, and you could find a little text in there that refers to some wheeling and dealing involving John Y. Hay, the governor, who would promise resources to UH if UH would actually do something like do some reallocations, like shut down certain small programs and like that. And you can read between the lines, guess who the target was? You're looking at it. Okay. One thing that was very useful in the 70s, in 1977, was the creation of JIMAR. And Dwayne didn't mention that in the lead in there, but for 16 years, Dennis Moore was the founding director, and I became the second director for 16 years, and Mark Merrifield is now the director. It led to a good joke because on October 1st, 2011, that was the transition from the old director to the new director because a new NOAA contract was issued. And I'm walking across campus over by Krause Hall, behind Krause Hall there, and walking the other way is a then fairly new vice president for communications and technology named David Lasner. And of course, when the JIMAR award comes out, it's kind of interesting because you have some bottom line on how much you can bring in a year. So we're like a $15 million a year event, 5-year grant or something like that. So it looks pretty impressive when the regents see it, and they see it in Hawaii, in Bachman Hall. So Lasner sees me and he giggles, points at me, says, "Ha ha, you used to be somebody." And I said, "Yeah, thank God I no longer am." With some friends of mine made I have 2 shirts made up that say I used to be somebody. My friends took advantage of that, so that's David Lasner created those shirts, basically. And of course, he's now the president, right? So, all right, so JIMAR was an important aspect because it led to a lot of connections for NOAA resources and like that. And it fed into some other things, which I'll get to. Then along came, we bumble along, into the 80s. And then, as Dwayne alluded, in 86, 89, we had this massive wave of retirements. I guess I ought to go to, I'm not even following, I just put this up here as a reminder, so I'm pretty much on schedule. We had the waves of retirements and resignations. There were 5 retirements and 1 resignation in those 3 years. It was a fellow named Mike Fullerton who actually was the director at Hilo for a while, and then resigned from Manoa to become a dean at Hilo. We had Takahashi who resigned rather than come to Manoa because we had to shut down cloud physics down there. We had Murakami, Sadler, Ramage, and Wan Ching Chu was another one of the faculty at that time, an original faculty member. And they all left, and we had Bin came in as a hire. The last year Ramage was chair. Bin was just there. Dave and Pao Shin came in a couple of years earlier. So we had, Daniels and I were tenured. We had 3 probationary faculty, and that's what we had at the point, which made us an even better target. But then as I say along, in kind of there's an old song or something called Along Came Jones or something like that from our youth. Well, along came SOIST. And the benefits of SOIST were there were a number of initiatives. There always are when there's a new school and new resources. And one initiative was trying to forge a MET-PO alliance, meteorology and physical oceanography. It's only, that ball has bounced back and forth how many times in the last 25, SOIST is 25 years old, but as Gymer director, about every 2 to 3 years, I'd have a visit from the whoever the new director, head of the PO division was, to talk about, can we still merge with meteorology or not? And then the talk would go away. I just kind of like a ritual. It was kind of like canon, that this would happen. But we did get very close to a merger. And I think Juan, again, Pao Shin and Dave were there in some of those meetings, right? So they can attest to that. Other initiatives, atmospheric chemistry, which actually could have been either department, but it ended up in oceanography as Tony Clark and Barry Hubert came in. So that was an initiative that Tony taught in the department. He taught cloud physics after me. Climate was an initiative that led to new positions like Fei Jin's. We also were now able to recruit replacements for the retirees. And, oh, by the way, a subtle thing, the National Weather Service relocation. This was an initiative from the 80s out of something called the modernization of the National Weather Service. The idea was to locate major weather centers, forecast offices, with universities, because of the universities had the technology that the Weather Service was starting to adapt. And there could be cross-fertilization, attending the briefings and things like that. Gary and I have had some fun times once in a while. Is it a tropical cyclone or not? Arguing with the guys at the forecast office, right? So we've had, and students, Weather Service people have taken, like Bob Ballard, in our program, right? So those kind of things. There's a historic origin for this, is that this was not something new. It turned out if you went back to the 1950s, this was exactly the situation at the University of Chicago and at the University of Miami. The University of Chicago, the Weather Service office in Chicago was in the same building with the Department of Meteorology at the University of Chicago, which is one of the originals from the 30s. Miami, you had the Hurricane Center and was located directly on the Coral Gables campus, as was the Hurricane Research, what was then called National Hurricane Research Lab, or something it was called back then. It grew into AOML eventually. So it had been done before, and you know why they usually broke up? Personalities. You get the department chair and the MIC who don't get along, and all of a sudden everything goes to hell. A lot of things we deal with around here are people getting along. That's a critical thing, and especially those that are going into any kind of career, that's an important thing anywhere. People getting along. Okay, but we were able to, it was ironic, there was an event I was at on Sunday where a very senior, powerful administrator and local politician asked me, how did you guys ever get the Weather Service onto campus, and why aren't they at Ford Island right now? And I said the answer was it was the modernization and the interplay, and by the way, they didn't really want to go to Ford Island. Several people, I retired, and at least one other, I know no official retired rather than go to Ford Island. They didn't want to go out there. But that's been an important thing for the department. You see that NOAA sign on the building, right? I ran into a vice chancellor, the other assistant vice chancellor, taking the new ROTC detachment leader over to introduce him to the forecast office and show him around. All right. Well, in '96 along came IPRC, which brought many more resources. The university made a remarkable commitment at that time of positions to this program. And it held up quite a while. I like to point out that for those that have been around long enough, Japan honored that original commitment to the university for over 15 years. Now think about how many commitments have been honored by anybody around here for 5 years, let alone 15. It's quite a testament to the persistence and honor of the people involved. It brought us tremendous resources. Okay? Now, that's history. A little more recent history, and this is stuff where I kind of get on the pulpit a little bit, but okay, how many are first-year students here? I got one or two. Okay, the rest of you have been here at least through the last year, right? So you've noted the chaos on campus over the last year over things like budgets and TA, quote, layoffs and like that. I have my backstory on that won't be said publicly, but I'll say there's some skunks out there that manipulated that. But the university has been under surveillance. There's a lot of strain on resources at universities, and you got to look outside the scope of Hawaii. This is nationwide. Okay, state support for public education. And one of the things that happened when Ramage retired in '87, one of the things I fell into was becoming the rep to the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, the consortium that runs NCAR. So I go off to that meeting, wet behind the ears, never been there, never been to that meeting before. The first thing that happens is I walk in and run into my old advisor from Purdue, who says, Tom, I want you to realize that your alma mater, this is in 1988, just went from becoming a state university to a state-supported university. And you know what that meant? That meant the state support to Purdue University had gone under 50%. Oh, yeah, that's 1988. Being a good, dutiful representative of the university, the vice president for research at the time, David Yount, cared very much about NCAR, partly because they wanted to do things with the old shuttle tanks. They wanted to use the external shuttle tanks as experimental labs and like that, and so the physicists thought that was neat stuff. He wanted to know what was going on. I get back and report, and I say, okay, here's the breaking news for you. Here's what's happening nationally on support of universities. And what do you think the reaction I got was? What do you think, Mike? It'll never happen here. Well, guys, it did. It has happened here. And the model of the tuition-driven models and this other stuff are plenty of chaos bouncing around, fights over resources, right? But this is something that's partly a reaction to the fact that the university has been very slow to react to anything. How many years did it change the positions in meteorology from HIG? Very slow to react, very hard to make decisions, but that's back there. It's back there. And it leads to internecine fusses between the arts and sciences and the organized research units, and you can get all kinds of pieces of this if you get around. Dwayne did his term as union president. He never saw any of it, right? Never. Okay. So that's where the campus right now is in this stress. And I suggested to the students, I had a few comments I was going to say about little words of wisdom or what passes for it. Okay. Oh yeah, other thing. UH finance realignments, by the way. What's in a name? See, I'm emeritus in meteorology. That's kind of fun because guess what? I'm now like the guy Philip Nolan in the history books, the man without a country. Because I'm emeritus in a department that doesn't exist anymore. Why? We changed the name. Now, there are arguments about this all around the country. You know, Penn State has a meteorology program. Florida State did till they kind of blended all their programs. So there are programs in either way. But I had this little tongue-in-cheek comment, what's in a name? It goes back to my high school senior year, and our civics teacher named Richard O'Dart, who once his favorite, one of his lines was, quoting Shakespeare, what's in a name? The way Shakespeare says, what, a rose by any name still smells as sweet. His version was, what's in a name, a rose by any other name still stinks. So what's in a name? But so yeah, I'm a man without a country. Another reason, but at least I can land in Portland. I can't, you know, the old story of the man without a country. I'd never want to see the United States again or something, so they put him on a ship and he just kept he never could land, right? That's the old story from the 18th century, right? Okay, some general comments, and I think I had up here, yeah. Some things that you should, for the students, this is mostly directed for the students. One thing that's special about this place is the international focus we have here. One of our alums who's out there in the world named Andy Nash was an undergraduate and graduate student here, and he's in the Weather Service, and he's in the Northeast somewhere now, right? In Burlington, Vermont. But the one thing we say, what do you remember most about like tropical meteorology? And his answer was Willis Island. Something that no other department in the country, Willis Island is a little island, an artificial island out there in the Coral Sea that's an Aussie weather station, kind of ground target for tropical cyclones in the Coral Sea. But we feature it because we show how an island the size of a supertanker actually had temperature and moisture gradients, depending on which way the wind blew on this. This little fascinated feature talking about Australia, or in honor of MH370, Isla de Reunion in the south. These are topics, places we look. We look as much at, you know, monsoon Asia as we do at Chicago in our perspective, right? And you'll see that. That's a different outlook. You won't see that at Purdue. So that's something that's always stood out here is the international focus. That it's a global picture we're looking at, not so parochial. Okay, so that's one. Item 2. This is one of my favorites. How did I end up out here? Partly because on my CV it showed that let me say one other thing. For our Asia Pacific role, the INSO Center, PIAC. That's a unique thing that we created here, partly because we had the help of social scientists who'd been Peace Corps workers. Mike Hamnett, former director of RCH, spent a year on Kapinga-Morongi. Look that up in your tropical weather. Find Kapinga-Morongi down on the equator. Okay, seize the opportunity. One of the things I find that's really, the reason I got here wasn't because I was a great tornado chaser. That's what I was doing back then. But my CV showed that I had enough background to cover a lot of different materials. First thing I did when I got here was teach cloud physics. Tornado chaser teaching cloud physics. Why? Well, but, you know, for my graduate school days, I never had to pay $1 of my tuition. Somebody else was, whether it was NASA or NOAA, but so I took every opportunity I could to expose myself to the curriculum. None of this minimalist crap. I took advantage of the opportunities. I see very few people do that. Oh, I need 12 credits to get my math. I need 16 credits or something, that's all I need, fine, I'll just do that. The minimalist approach. And the thing I want to point out is, and we could ask this of Dave and Dwayne and Gary, you know, when you were in grad school, and you had your idea where you were going to be, 10 years later, were you anywhere there? Was that not even close? Okay, this concept, I'm going to go through this motion, I'm going to go here, I'm going to end up here, doesn't work. So take advantage of it. This is your last great chance to explore almost. You know, we usually use this palaver with the undergraduate programs, right? But graduate students have opportunities too. Use them. You'll be better off in the long run. And the other thing, I'm glad Tom Robbins is back there somewhere. Did I see Tom? Yeah. You can check him out, but get out of your office and observe what's going on. And one of the interesting things I think Tom would say is his experience in GSO. Because you learn a lot about the whole enterprise, right? How it works or doesn't work. You'll see how other people on the campus deal with a lot of a TA in, you know, in biology versus what you're doing here in SOIST. In atmospheric sciences, did I say that? Atmospheric sciences. I'll keep practicing. So take advantage of this. You know, holding up in your little cubicle, I mean, I think of a guy back in the 70s who, Gary, you know, will know of right away from the University of Wisconsin, who was so narrow focused that you basically he was the kind of person that you would probably lock in a room with the computer terminal and feed him once in a while and take outputs from him. Bob Schlesinger, right? That guy was trapped for the rest of his life because he never could go anywhere because he never left the University of Wisconsin. He had no way to market himself. Never left, right? That's a thing to think about. Don't be so monolithic. Get out of the office and see what's going on. Observe what's happening. Read the morning paper. Read Kaleo. Talk to students across the campus. This is your last great chance. So, and I think Dwayne had a I think it's to Dwayne, right? For a slide?
I'm not sure.
I think it is. I think that's where I'm running out. Yeah. Anybody want to ask me? A mind note, right?
I'm right at divided among the hundreds of it. And roughly, so you know, roughly at 4:30, we're going to head outside because we can't eat cake in here. We'll go outside and we're going to cake up there. Say aloha to President Schroeder. So, questions, anyone? Comments? Why in the world did you stay in Hawaii for 21 years? Et cetera.
Well, you know the great answer to that is? This is a good line from our youth. It seemed like the thing to do at the time. That's a little line from for those of us from the 60s, right? Why did you do that? It seemed like the thing to do at the time. I was in a great place, you know, like the opportunities and the perspectives here, right? You know, the right people aren't here today particularly, but this is kind of a unique memory stick. It's monogrammed with my name on it. gift from National Taiwan University. 2007, National Taiwan invited a bunch of us, in Wang, Fei, Jane McCreary from IPRC, Nicholas Schneider, over to a meeting at National Taiwan University to talk about collaboration with the University of Hawaii academic program. Along the way, they paid us cash, by the way, they gave us cash instead of checks so we could carry a wallet in and out of the country. But every one of us got one of these monogram. So that's a little souvenir I still have. Something you wouldn't do at Purdue. You get 5 of you fly over to Taiwan for a week. Yeah.
What are some other international experiences that you've had with other international communities?
Oh, well, me personally, tropical cyclone motion work in the 80s and 90s. It was funded by the Office of Naval Research, but it involved, they could fund anybody in the world. So we had Australians, we had Germans, TCM 90 and TCM 92, I guess it was, in Guam. Some of our students participated.
What did you study?
We're looking at exactly tropical, how to improve the motion of forecast for tropical cyclones, because it was causing a major nightmare. It was motion, we've worked with saturation bomb that for 25 years now, so the track models are pretty darn good, but so now we can't do intensity. But no, that was one, and there are other international programs that I was not involved in myself. Gary over there, Toga Core.
EMEX.
Tropical, yeah, EMEX. Toga Core, which was a couple ocean atmosphere response experiment in the West Pacific, 1990, winter 92-93. One of the oceanographic mind behind it was Dr. Roger Lucas, emeritus from Ocean Art. And Gary was out there, graduate students were out there, on ships, on planes.
There is a very active international office for students here. Some of us have gotten to know the director over there, and if there were some push to organize something behind the field experiment, the office is set up and the structure is set up. So just
Yeah, there are other programs. What's the pick on
Momex?
Steve Howell? Well, we're going back.
79.
No, we're talking about Momex.
Momex.
Monex 79, monsoon experiment. That was a big one. Oh, I want to talk about this issue about where you're going to end up in life. Poster child, because Monex reminded me of that. You were along on that, but there was a grad student who went along on that also.
Oh.
Okay, when I came here in '74, I remember I'd hang out with I'm learning my way around. So I'd hang out around the synoptic class, and like the old weather lab was where the HIG, where the SOS fiscal office is now. Big thing, set up little light tables. We used light tables and did hand drawing back then. Can you believe that? I watched Jim Satter wear his elbows raw, doing the analyses for the gate experiment on wind fields and like that. He had, just hand analysis, the old-fashioned way. So I sat there and would talk to the students. And one day we're sitting out there when a front's coming by, and I said, well, you know, if a water spout were to form, it'd be right about there. And of course, providentially, what happened? A water spout formed. But one of the students was a guy named Stephen Lyons. He was a transfer student at JUCO. He was actually on the last University of Hawaii men's track and field team. Never heard much about him. He had a more famous guy named Terry Alfred, who held the national record in shot put pro on, was on that team. But Steve was really into weather. He was a surfer dude from Long Beach. And he stayed on for a master's, which he did with me, on weather on Haleakala. Actually, he inspired himself on that by running up to Haleakala, running up there, and then seeing that there were a lot of observing facilities that the Air Force and the astronomers had. And he said that he formulated his own nice little thesis. Then he went and did a PhD with Murakami on more classical mid-latitude almost dynamics. So that's interesting background, right? PhD. He ends up moving around the country quite a bit. Well, what was his most famous? Why is he most famous? He's a recognizable name.
Weather Channel.
He was, for 12 years, he was the hurricane specialist on the Weather Channel. Now, what's that got to do with a PhD in dynamic meteorology?
I mean, I feel like that's really correlated.
Well, it's not perfectly correlated. He found
It's definitely correlated, you know, you have.
Not
this
predictable.
one type of music.
But I mean, not predictable, right?
Other people.
Not predictable that he would have got there. You know, it's a good story.
Professor for a year and a half.
He was here for a little while. He bounced around. He's now in San Angelo, Texas, at the MIC. But the story about this is interesting also. This is in twice I had episodes. Once it was in Washington D.C. at the Sheraton, at a National Hurricane Conference, a FEMA conference, emergency management. Steve's there representing the Weather Channel. And we're standing in the lobby having a chat, and a little boy, about 8 years old, runs up to me. Dr. Lyons, my mother would like you to come over and have your picture taken with her. A few years later, we flash back to, we're up in the Wyndham Hotel or whatever, well, not Wyndham, I forget what the hotel was in Orlando at another conference. And we're sitting in the BAR, Steve and I. And I'm on the phone, I was on the phone with Gary. Talking to Gary, and I said, oh, sorry, Gary, I have to hang up now. A couple of Steve's groupies are approaching us. People wanting to get his autograph. Now, how many meteorologists will ever have that happen in their life?
One, Jim Lyons.
This was the guy that started out, doing the weather of Haleakala. But I mean, so you don't know where you're going to hit that. That's the point of it. Don't restrict yourself. That's the point.
Midnight arrives in 2 minutes, or before.
Yeah, Mike.
I'd just like to make a perspective on the big event that happened here 20 years ago. We lived on both sides of university autonomy.
Ah. Well, I'll tell you, I have a number of views on this, but I'll tell you the one thing. Remember, Mortimer had a number of things, principles of autonomy, right? One thing he did, which I think we all regret. What was one of his first principles? We had to have the ability to hire our own lawyers. And that has turned out to be the biggest impediment to things getting done around here, probably than anything else. Because these guys are so risk averse and so clueless. And by the way, I've been a consultant. Anybody else? Wayne's done some. Who does some consulting? I've dealt with lawyers. I got news for you. They may know something about the law, but they don't know a lot about a lot else. And so the worst thing Mortimer ever did was get us our own lawyers. And I can tell you a story. There's a related story to that because I actually was sued along with some very interesting people like David Morrison and Victor Stinger, Paul Kurtz. We were sued over our activities as part of the Hawaii Skeptics. Skeptical Society, National Critical Thinking, Free Inquiry Publications, and like that. It's been around a long time, mostly out there to debunk pseudoscience. And we got into a tussle over some fellow who was teaching telekinesis as a worldwide proven phenomenon in non-credit courses somewhere. And we said, we can't get away with that in a course description. We started raising some, the Amazing Randy was one of the defendants also. Well, this particular person had an attorney wife. And so it turned out suddenly we were sued in federal court on several grounds. One of them was we were interfering with his constitutional right to teach at a university. And it there was one. But so now you're being sued, what do you do? Well, you gotta get a lawyer, right? Well, actually, you see, I went over to see what was then the deputy AG. And then we had an attorney general assigned to the campus. And this guy was a fellow named Robert Marks. He was eventually Attorney General years later. And I said, well, I use this in my class. It's Critical Thinking 101. In 101, I would explain the physics of, soil and versus water by explaining how do you walk on hot coals. I do a discussion of walking on hot coals. It had a historical reason because we had a big scandal where the UH football team spent a fortune to do fire walks for motivation. Tony Robinson. The skeptics kind of picked on him. But I said, well, it's part of teaching basic science, critical thinking. Oh, he said, yeah, I want this case. You'll never hear that from a current university attorney. He said, I want this case. Now, it turned out the case was, the court threw it out so fast, it was this was a federal case. But the wife they were hit with so many frivolous motion penalties and like that. When last seen, the guy was selling hardware at Sears. But I mean, here came Robert Marks. He said, I want this case. That's a different arrangement than dealing with, try it now. We have enough issues with ship operations and other things we do in SOAS that we're continually hamstrung by the lawyers. After which play was that Shakespeare and other plays, the line is, first of all, do what? Kill all the lawyers. What are 100 lawyers on the bottom of the Atlantic? Good start. We did the lawyers. I got lawyer jokes. I also got Australian Australian jokes if you want to get those, but I have that's 14 when they start.
The clock shows 4:30. It's time for our last slide. Okay? And so the date there, this week